The other afternoon, I was driving my granddaughter home from school. The sun was already low, the tired late day light slipping across the dashboard. She got into the passenger seat and shut the door, slow and quiet. Her face wasn't upset. It wasn't angry either. It was something else, like a room after someone leaves and forgets to turn the lamp back on. She's 15, still growing into her own shadow. I asked how school went. She lifted one shoulder. I asked if anything happened. She said no. The car hummed along, the air conditioner clicking on and off, dust drifting in the light between us. After a while, without looking at me, she said, "Grandpa, does it ever feel like none of it really counts?" I didn't answer right away. I'm 87. I've watched cities change names, people disappear, promises expire. I've buried friends who once felt permanent. I've held regrets small enough to fit in a pocket and heavy enough to bend a spine. That question didn't surprise me. What surprised me was hearing it from someone who hasn't even begun to look back yet. She was staring forward into whatever comes next. I was staring backward into whatever I didn't notice while it was happening. Most of my life, I thought meaning was something you chased, something loud, something that arrived with proof. You did work that mattered, you made an impression, you were seen. The world encourages that idea quietly all the time. It doesn't shout, it just nudges. Be visible, be remembered, don't waste your life. What no one tells you is that the moments that stay invisible while you're living them often turn out to be the ones that endure. There was a woman on our block named Margaret, 3 houses down, same place, same porch for over 40 years. She taught elementary school, third grade, same classroom, same alphabet border on the wall year after year. She never married, never talked about wanting to. She waved when you passed. Sometimes she brought over muffins that were always a little too dry. When she retired, the school held a small thing in the gym, folding chairs, paper cups, a plaque. I remember thinking it was about right. She never seemed to want more than that. She died 2 years later quietly. No warning, no long illness. I went to the funeral expecting the same modest scale. I was wrong. The church was full. People stood along the walls. Some waited outside. One by one they spoke. Not eloquently, not rehearsed. A man said she was the first adult who didn't make him feel stupid. A woman said she learned to read in that classroom after being passed along for years. Another man, older now, said he became a teacher because of her, and he brought his daughter so she could hear the story. Margaret never stood on a stage big enough to be noticed. She never thought of herself as important. She went to work, learned names, stayed a little late, paid attention. She corrected spelling, explained fractions, listened. That was it. Decades later, the room was still full. I didn't tell my granddaughter any of that right away. We sat at a red light. The fan rattled softly. I could hear kids laughing somewhere outside the car. I thought about how often I'd mistaken silence for insignificance. How many times I'd overlooked the ordinary because it didn't announce itself. The light changed. I drove on. She didn't ask the question again, but it stayed with me. It still does. And sometimes late in the day when the house is quiet and the window is cracked open just enough to let the air move, I wonder how many things in my own life mattered more than I ever realized, and how many I was too busy to see while they were happening. I've come to think we misunderstand what it means to count for something. For most of my life, I assumed it meant being noticed, having a name people recognized, leaving something behind that proved you'd been here. I chased that idea quietly without ever admitting it to myself. Looking back, I can see how tired it made me. What I didn't see then was how life actually moves. Not in headlines, not in milestones. It moves in small exchanges, usually when no one is paying attention. A sentence said at the right moment, a pause instead of a reply, a presence that doesn't try to improve the silence. Those moments never feel important while they're happening. They feel forgettable, easy to step over. When I was 39, I was coming apart in ways I didn't know how to name. My business was slipping. Bills stacked up in a drawer I stopped opening. Nights got longer. Mornings came too early. I drank more than I should have and slept in short, shallow stretches. I remember feeling like I had missed some instruction everyone else received. One evening, I sat in my car outside a bar, engine off keys, still in my hand. The neon sign flickered. I told myself I'd decide in a minute. That's when Tom knocked on the window. I barely knew him. We'd crossed paths a few times. Nothing more. He asked where I was headed. I shrugged. He said he was going to get coffee and asked if I wanted to come along. No concern in his voice, no urgency, just an invitation. We ended up in a diner with cracked vinyl booths and a ceiling fan that wobbled when it turned. We sat there a long time. He talked about his kids, a book he couldn't finish, a trip he took years earlier that he still thought about. He never asked me what was wrong, never tried to help. Somewhere in the middle of that ordinary conversation, the tightness in my chest eased. When we left, I didn't go back to the bar. I went home. I can't tell you what we said that did it. I don't think there was a single thing. But that night bent in a different direction because of him. Tom probably forgot it by morning. I didn't. That's how these things work. They don't arrive with sound. There's no signal telling you that something you did mattered. Most of the time, you never find out. You just move on, assuming it was nothing. My wife Eleanor understood this better than I did. She wrote letters, real ones, longhand, stamps, envelopes. She wrote to our kids when they were away, to old friends, to people who crossed her mind while she was folding laundry. I used to joke that phones existed for a reason. She'd smile and keep writing. After she died, I found boxes of replies, people telling her they still had her letters, that they'd read them more than once, that they'd kept them through moves and divorces and quiet years when no one called. She wasn't trying to leave a mark. She was just reaching outward one person at a time. The house feels different now, quieter. In the late afternoon, light settles into corners it used to pass through. The kitchen fan hums while no one listens. A window stays half open because it always did. Dust drifts. I notice things I didn't before. I think about how much energy I spent believing my life needed to rise above itself. How often that belief made me miss what was right in front of me. Maybe a life isn't meant to be impressive. Maybe it's meant to be steady, present, available. I don't know. I only know that the moments I carry with me now aren't the ones I worked hardest for. They're the ones that slipped in quietly when I wasn't looking and stayed. For a long time, I believed the ordinary didn't add up to much. That unless a life could be wrapped into something impressive, it barely registered. Work quietly done, care given without witnesses, decency without an audience. It all seemed too small to count. Now I'm not so sure how anything ever held together without it. Most days are carried by people whose names won't be repeated. Parents awake at hours when the world is asleep. Men and women who do their jobs carefully and go home without applause. Friends who notice a change in someone's voice and don't ignore it. Hands that pass plates, wipe tables, clear paths, close gates behind them. Little gestures, barely visible, keeping the ground from giving way. I used to ask myself whether any of it really mattered. I hear that question differently now. It's a noisy question. It wants scale, proof, something you can point to. And the longer I've lived, the more suspicious I've become of things that need to be pointed at. What seems closer to the truth is quieter. It's whether your being there or not being there changes anything for the people close enough to feel it. When my grandson was small, he wouldn't go near water. The pool might as well have been an edge. Every afternoon that summer, we went together, 15 minutes at a time. I stood beside him where his feet could still touch the bottom. No urging, no instructions, just standing. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. By August, he was swimming on his own. He's grown now, taller than me, busy. I doubt he remembers those afternoons. I do. Not because they were special, but because they were quiet enough to matter. If I hadn't stood there patiently doing almost nothing, the fear might have stayed. That seems to be how these things work. The years have thinned my appetite for what once looked solid. Titles sleep, achievements blur, stories shorten when other people tell them. But certain things don't dissolve so easily. The way you made space for someone, the way you stayed when it would have been simpler to leave, the way you noticed. Last week at the grocery store, the cashier looked worn down, slower than the line behind her wanted, shadows under her eyes. I could have paid and gone. Instead, I asked how she was without rushing past the answer. She hesitated. Then something in her loosened. She said she'd been working extra shift because her mother was sick. We spoke for only a few minutes. I told her it sounded like she was doing something decent, even if no one was saying it out loud. That was all. The bags were light. The walk to the car took longer than it used to. The air was still. Late afternoon again. Dust floating where the sun reached it. I don't know if that conversation stayed with her. I know it stayed with me. And these days, that's often how I tell. Not by what echoes loudly, but by what follows me home in silence and refuses to leave. When I stood up to leave, she thanked me. Then she said it again as if the words needed a second try to stay in the air. I walked out with my bags and didn't look back. Whatever that exchange was, it was already over. It won't be remembered by anyone else. It won't show up anywhere. But in that narrow slice of time, I think it steadied her. And that was enough. I've turned my granddaughter's question over many times since then. Not out loud, quietly. The way you do with something that doesn't want an answer so much as it wants company. Do the things we do really count? If they do, they rarely count the way we imagine. They don't announce themselves. They don't collect proof. They live in choices so small they're easy to miss, choosing not to snap. When you could what's true when it would be simpler. Not to staying put when walking away would cost less. A life doesn't need to draw attention to justify itself. It needs a certain steadiness, a willingness to be there, to notice, to keep showing up even when the body drags and the day feels thin. That kind of attention takes more out of you than applause ever did. It asks for patience when you're tired, care when it's inconvenient. Silence when talking would be easier. I'm 87 now. Mornings take longer. Afternoons slip by faster. House settles around me differently than it used to. When I think about what remains, it isn't anything I can point to. I think about phases, about pauses that didn't rush past, about moments when I stayed long enough for someone else to feel less alone. Those are the parts that feel solid now. The light outside is low again. The fan hums. The window is open just enough. Dust moves slowly through the room, visible only when the sun heats it right. I don't know how many moments like that I have left. I only know they don't look like much while they're happening. And I wonder how many of mine I noticed in time.